shall I just go for it then? Shall we begin video mode?
Okay.
This
Yeah.
is as weird for me as it, well, actually, it's probably slightly more weird for you, but it's also weird for me. So
Okay.
if anything kind of goes wrong, we could just edit that out later.
Okay,
So,
no problem.
this is Christine Jieun Yi, who is a lecturer at Kanda University of International Studies with the Department of English. Oh, I said it all wrong now. See, I'm glad we're not live. What department are you at, Christine?
Uh, yeah, maybe just like lecture at Kanda International or Kanda University of International Studies.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
you're just about to start there, aren't you?
Mhm.
And you've just finished your master's degree at Sophia University under the wonderful tutelage of Professor Lisa Fairbrother, who I think deserves a shout out. By the way, did you tell Lisa that we were doing this video?
Oh yeah, she was really excited. She was just like, "Oh yeah, a lot of people watch his website." I was like, "Ah."
No, they don't. That's nice of her to say. Do they? I don't look at any of the analytics. Maybe it is a big deal. I don't know. I doubt it though. But it's nice of Lisa to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Anyway,
she
I think a lot more people will watch the website when I actually have some interesting content on it, which is why you're here to tell us about your research. So, take it away, Christine.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Christine Yi, um, and my MA thesis was on exploring English teachers' responses to discursive discrimination in Japanese educational settings. So, one of the goals of Japanese education is to realize justice by treating everyone fairly and impartially without discrimination or prejudice. And this is written inside of the National Curriculum Standards for Education. So, in other words, this is Japanese law, and this is supposed to be fostered through moral education studies. In fact, the Ministry of Education has a publication on how teachers should teach moral education, which states that it is necessary for teachers to resolutely correct action and words that are based on prejudice and discrimination. And this applies to English teachers as well, because the National Curriculum Standards for English states that English classes should be carried out in accordance with the goals and content of moral education studies. However, despite these policies, there are several issues. One is that the ambiguous wording of the statements on discrimination and discriminatory remarks makes it unclear to teachers as to what exactly is discrimination and how they should effectively address it inside of the classroom. Second is that studies have shown that discriminatory language is still a very prevalent issue inside of educational spaces and is being noted by English teachers from students and coworkers. So, in light of these issues, this study investigated how English teachers address discriminatory remarks in their workplaces from both students and coworkers. So, in my literature review, I talk about discrimination. And while there are many definitions for this widely used term, a lot of them focus on the creation of inequality and the act of othering. I also use the term discursive discrimination a lot throughout my research, and it's coined by Boreas, and she describes it as discrimination manifested in discourse or discrimination that's expressed through language. Now, according to Boreas, there are four types of discursive discrimination or ways that it can occur. Negative other presentation, exclusions from discourse, proposals for unfavorable treatment, and discriminatory objectification. So, studies have shown that ideologies such as native speakerism, globalization and cultural essentialism, and heteronormativity can give rise to certain discriminatory actions. Also, studies have shown that discursive discrimination in education can occur through othering people based on factors such as race, gender, disabilities, linguistic factors, and nationality. So to analyze the data for this study, I use language management theory as a theoretical and analytical framework. So LMT examines people's behavior towards language or how they deal with certain language problems. So in this study, the language problem was discursive discrimination. And I used the LMT process cycle by Kimura and Fairbrother, which starts at the noting stage where something is noted as a deviation from a certain norm or expectation. Then it's evaluated negatively, positively, or neutrally, which may lead to planning of a certain action to address the language problem, which may lead to its implementation, and finally, lead to a post-implementation, which is a feedback or verification of that implemented action. Now, this may lead to further noting or the establishment of new norms. So for this study, I asked the following research questions. So what kinds of discursive discrimination do English teachers encounter in educational settings? How do English teachers evaluate and make adjustments towards discursive discrimination from students and other teachers? What factors influence English teachers' decisions to evaluate and make adjustments toward discursive discrimination? And finally, what constraints prevent English teachers from taking action to address situations where discursive discrimination occurs? So to collect data for this study, I used a questionnaire and semi-structured interviews. So I used a questionnaire to gain a lot of responses from a wide pool of participants. And for my interviews, well, the participants were recruited from the questionnaire based on the demographic information that they provided. So all of the interviews were conducted on Zoom and lasted for about 60 minutes. And afterwards, member checks were conducted with each participant to check the validity of my analysis. So in total, I had 56 responses for the questionnaire, and most of my responses came from people from the inner circle and people who mostly identified as female. However, previous studies on English teachers' experiences with discursive discrimination in Japan and Japanese workplaces have had similar demographics. As for my interview participants, I had 5 participants from overseas and 2 Japanese English teacher participants. And when selecting these participants, I wanted to represent a wide variety of different races, countries, genders, and teaching experiences. So to analyze my data, I highlighted where each stage of language management occurred within the data. Then I would take the noting stage, or the discriminatory remark that was being said, and I would code it according to the table on the left, where I would write what was being said, the basis for othering, the type of discursive discrimination that was occurring according to Boreas's 4 types, and the person engaging in it. Afterwards, the other stages of language management were coded by hand and clustered together, which gave rise to the themes for this study. So here are the results of my analysis. I found that the most common type of discursive discrimination noted by teachers was negative other presentation, followed by exclusions from discourse, proposals for unfavorable treatment, and then discriminatory objectification. There were some instances where it was difficult to identify what kinds of discursive discrimination it was. However, I'll explain this later in my presentation. So here are the themes for negative other presentation. I found negative other presentation regarding xenophobia, portraying foreigners in a negative light in comparison to Japanese people, targeting specific countries, in regards to race, where Black people were often portrayed as primates or being laughed at by students, or dark skin was seen as something to ridicule or mock. Also in regards to gender, more towards the female gender or males who exhibit certain feminine characteristics, as well as those with disabilities, where students would often use disabilities as a way to insult each other. So here is an example from Jane's interview, and Jane was one of my participants from the Philippines, and she has an example of how Black people were being portrayed as primates. So she said that sometimes when the students would see a Black character or Black person inside of their educational materials, such as their textbooks, they would say, oh, that's a gorilla or some sort of monkey. And several other English teachers also noted similar examples. As for exclusions from discourse, I noticed that this would occur more towards Asian teachers from overseas, where they'd discursively be positioned as non-native English speakers or not really be acknowledged as the foreigner inside of their workplace. It also occurred towards those who are LGBTQIA, more notably those in the trans community, through the action of misgendering. There's also a lot of uses of the phrase certain groups only, such as males only or Japanese teachers only. As for proposals for unfavorable treatment, this occurred mostly towards women or towards the LGBTQIA community. And it sometimes occurred towards people from overseas. However, this was less varied, and it was often proposals for them to go back to their home country. So this example was taken from Rebecca's interview, and Rebecca was one of my Asian American participants, and she said that she had a coworker who said, "Oh, we should deduct points from a student's essay because it's a boy writing about wanting to have a boyfriend." So as we can see, this is a clear proposal for unfavorable treatment towards someone belonging to the LGBTQIA community. As for discriminatory objectification, I found that this mostly targeted women in the form of sexual harassment or positioning them as domestic workers. Now, when it came to difficult to identify discursive discrimination, I found this relevant to two cases. One was overlapping discursive discrimination, where I tried to take a discriminatory remark, but I found that it could fit into two or more of Boreas's four categories. And this would typically occur where there'd be intersecting identity factors such as race and gender. In the case of uncategorizable discursive discrimination, I found this when a discriminatory remark couldn't fit into any of Boreas's four types. So here's an example of that, taken again from Rebecca's interview, where teachers would be introduced to her for the first time and they would see her last name and say, "Oh, well, your English is actually fluent or natural. It sounds like you studied a lot." So they'd sort of compliment her English skills. So this made Rebecca feel very discriminated against and was very offensive to her. However, when I tried to categorize this into Boreas's four categories, it really couldn't fit into any of them. However, I did find that it matched with Esid's definition of underestimation, which is underestimating someone's abilities or skills based on their race. So here are the evaluations for discursive discrimination. So I found that teachers mostly evaluated their responses negatively. So here in the word cloud on the left, you can see some of the words that they use to sort of describe their feelings towards hearing discursive discrimination. And as you can see from the tables, like there's no positive evaluations of discursive discrimination. However, there were few neutral evaluations. However, this would only occur when discursive discrimination was seen as something normal or expected for people to engage in. So lack of adjustments refers to when a teacher evaluates discursive discrimination negatively, but doesn't really take any actions to sort of address it. And I found that this would occur more often towards coworkers than towards students' discursive discrimination. And this was found to be related to social relationships and power dynamics within these relationships. So here are the different strategies that teachers use to address discursive discrimination. So one is problematizing and lecturing, which is explaining to someone what they said was wrong and why. Seeking help from a third party, expressing disagreement, sort of saying, "Oh, no, I don't think so." Using Japanese, reprimanding, and questioning. So I found that some teachers used a combination of different strategies to address one single instance of discursive discrimination. I also found that management strategies actually tended to be more direct and varied when it came to students' discursive discrimination as opposed to coworkers. So as you can see from this Venn diagram, reprimanding was only used towards students as it's quite confrontational. Also, in the table on the right, we can see that the strategy that was most commonly used towards students was problematizing and lecturing, and it wasn't really used that much towards coworkers as it may come off as patronizing. However, the most common used strategy for coworkers was expressing disagreement, as this was a softer approach. So here are some factors that sort of influence teachers to make adjustments. Their self-perceived responsibilities as teachers, considering the intentions of the students and coworkers around them, whether or not they felt supported from their coworkers, the place, time, and occasion that the discursive remark occurred under, the topic of discursive discrimination, their own personal experiences, their overall classroom atmosphere or student behavior, as well as the cultural appropriateness of raising an issue within the context of their Japanese workplace. So here are some factors that prevented them from taking actions, such as their Japanese language ability, their identity as a foreigner, their social relationship with others, the age of themselves and others, and power. So we can see from this excerpt from Sachiko's interview, who was one of my Japanese participants, how social relationships and power sort of had an influence on preventing her from speaking out against discursive discrimination. So she says, there are times where I sort of hesitate when I haven't really established a relationship with my students yet. analyzing the post-implementation or after a teacher took action, I found that teachers often expressed frustration and disappointment when their coworkers didn't really do anything to address discursive discrimination. I also found that teachers engaged in self-reflexivity after implementing certain adjustments, showing that they sort of learned through the process of combating discursive discrimination. So to answer research question number 1, what kinds of discursive discrimination do English teachers encounter? Well, I found all 4 types of racist discursive discrimination, in addition to a new type showing that there are other ways of expressing discursive discrimination beyond these 4 types. We could also see that the effects of ideologies can definitely be seen in some of the discourses that were being used by both students and coworkers. There was also a preference for whiteness, which sort of threatened how some teachers, particularly those of colors, viewed their own authenticity as English teachers. Also, coworkers engaged in a lot of proposals for unfavorable treatment, more than that of students, which was quite problematic. As for how do English teachers evaluate and make adjustments, well, I found that most evaluations tended to be negative. And the fact that more confrontational strategies were used towards students as opposed to coworkers really shows how important power dynamics are within and how important they are in influencing teachers' responses. As for what factors influence English teachers' decisions to evaluate and make adjustments, definitely teacher identity was a big one. So the more that teachers saw it as their own responsibility to correct students' behavior, the more likely they were to implement adjustments and confront the issue. Also, contextual factors such as workplace environment and the behavior of those around them greatly influence their responses. So what constraints prevented English teachers from taking action? Well, I found that the less capital that a teacher had, the more likely they were to experience certain constraints. In my discussion, I also talk about intentionality. So as we've seen from the data and through this study, certain ideologies play a large role in discursive discrimination. So people may not always intend harm when making discriminatory remarks, and they just may be saying things that are reflecting a larger problem within society. So as Wodak says, discourse is where discriminatory practices are implemented, justified, and legitimatized, but there are also sort of spaces for us to dissect them and address them as well. So this study has several limitations, such as the lack of Japanese participants, the representation from just one demographic, and reliance on recall. However, I found that its findings were very important, sort of points to important implications in the future of English education. So for example, maybe the Ministry of Education could make clear instructions for how teachers should deal with discrimination. And maybe local boards of education could have more teacher training on discursive discrimination and how they could occur inside of the classroom and sort of point to the importance of that. And maybe English teachers could have more collaboration with those around them and other subject teachers to really make sure that discursive discrimination isn't affecting the students and other teachers around them. So thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
So thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it the second time round as well. I was impressed at how close it was to the way you talked the first time round. Like it was bang on. But it's really fascinating research, and I wondered, like, you must have had some really personal motivations for doing this research, and I think anyone who does that kind of research has some personal experiences. In my case, me and my colleague Robert Lowe, we've been trying to write about issues like this, but we're very sensitive about it as well because as people who are not from Japan, it's kind of a sensitive issue, and it's really an issue of power as well, isn't it? And I think a lot of people are very reluctant to talk about these things for a fear of like offending the host country or painting an image that Japan is like a place where there's a lot of racism or discrimination. And I think every country has discrimination. I'm from Britain. We have horrible incidents there. the very first day that me and my partner arrived from Heathrow, and she's not from England. And when we walked down the street, and someone made a racist remark within moments of her arriving in the country. So this isn't just an isolated thing about Japan, but yeah, were you a little bit worried about raising some of these issues? Did you feel your own sense of power being challenged, or those aspects that you talked about, the constraints? Did you feel that you had any constraints on you with your research?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I was really like scared to do this. This topic was really important to me because like when I was teaching as an assistant language teacher in ALT in Japan, sometimes I would sort of hear like these like comments or discursive discrimination like occurring inside of my workplace and just like being just like shooken by it. Like, I was so like surprised, like, oh, like what do I do about this? And not being able to do anything about that just really like made me sad. And I felt like, yeah, those constraints that the participants felt. And sometimes I'd see some Japanese teachers or my teaching partners try to address the situation, but it wouldn't. It sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't, and that was sort of like shocking for me as well. So I was wondering like how other teachers sort of dealt with this and if this is like something that they care about. And through my research, I was surprised by how many respondents I had gotten from that. So definitely, yeah, I was really afraid of choosing this topic, but it was something that I was like genuinely curious about, because I would see how discursive discrimination really affected those around me, like not only like the other teachers, but also like some of the students, like when they would hear some of this happening. I saw some children cry, in the classroom, and I'm just like, as a teacher, that's like one of the most heartbreaking things, to see. Um, so definitely like this topic was really, really important for me to sort of address, but at the same time, I was so like I was trying to be really careful in how I was wording things and overall, like I was wondering, like, should I do this project? Should I not do it? So there was a lot of back and forth that sort of went on in my head when I was pursuing this project. However, in the end, I hope that, someone can gain something from it and that, eventually it'll sort of like, show people that, other people are dealing with this as well. Because, when I was hearing it, like in my own practices, I sort of felt alone and isolated. I didn't know what to do with the situation. Yeah. So that was my experience with it.
That's really interesting, and it's there's a lot of people in Japan who hate to see this kind of discrimination as well. Obviously, this is kind of a few bad actors, I hope. I mean, this isn't the majority of discourse that happens, but the fact that it does still happen kind of out in public, and it's like accepted or it's treated as a joke. You talked about intentionality, and I suppose like a bunch of I don't know, a bunch of young boys at school. They're trying to like, jostle each other, and they just make a casual joke about the appearance of someone in their foreign language textbook. They probably don't think of that as a really racist remark, but it is. It really is, and it's not acceptable. But one of the things that you didn't really talk about, which I kind of wanted to talk about this when I last watched your presentation was microaggressions, because your discursive discrimination is, microaggressions are really hard to pin down, aren't they? You like I had a sort of what I would consider a microaggression in my classroom just a few weeks ago. So I was doing a class about feminism, and I held up a book by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. But as I said her name, one of the students at the back kind of sniggered and laughed at his friend. And it was exactly at the moment that I said Chimamanda's name. And I wondered, is that just a coincidence that they just happened to laugh at that moment, or are they laughing at her funny sounding name? And I didn't know how to deal with it at the time. Like, should I stop the class and say, "What are you laughing at?" Or, should I just let it blow over? And I let it blow over in the end, but it's still like weeks later, I'm thinking, should I have said something? So it's that feeling of being alone, like I think that's really interesting that you uncovered that in your research. But you kind of obviously you had to pick up on things that you could actually, that were discursive, and that were, more solid. But did you get any like little mini microaggressions that had to not be included in your research data?
Oh yeah, what was it? There was actually something involving names as well. Like a student I think was had roots from another country from outside Japan, and they had a non, I guess, Japanese sounding name, and my one of my Japanese participants said that students would often laugh at that, and she felt like it was really important to sort of like address these issues. So she would just like confront the students like like obviously he's not gonna have a name like you guys, so like why are you guys saying that or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I found it weird that they would laugh at that name when obviously like my name isn't Japanese and they would find that sort of strange. But maybe it was just the fact that I don't know how they knew like what I don't even know if they were laughing at the name, to be honest.
Mm.
But and that's the slippery thing, and it's another thing about that intentionality. Like a lot of the issues around racist discourse are about the fact that people hide, like nobody wants to admit that they're a racist, because everyone knows racism is bad. So when people are racist, they wrap it up in disclaimers and they use denial. And I use I often talk about the work of Theun van Dyke in my lectures about critical race theory, because he kind of identified these disclaimers where you kind of say like, oh, I have nothing against these people, but blah blah blah, and then you start to pile in the racist comments, but you've kind of wrapped it up in something that sounds normalizing, or you might even say it's not me who has a problem, but my clients don't like it or something like that. So you can like a lot of passing the book, or it's very slippery. Racist language is not usually direct. It's usually very slippery and hard to pin down. So that makes your research all the more valuable, I think, Christine.
Yeah. As for like, yeah, I think like nobody wants to be seen as a racist. I think that's like something that Von Dijk like also says, like, it's just like sort of like universal understanding that we all have as people that we don't want to be painted as racist.
And what was the other thing I want? So the issue of power is a big one as well, especially like I've been in Japan, like, oh, it's not 20 years, but it's coming up for 20 years now. And my Japanese ability could definitely be better. But, partly I feel like that because of the way I've been treated as a foreigner, as a Japanese second language speaker. Like quite often, you either get two extremes, people will be like, wow, your Japanese is amazing, Jozu, and great, you can use chopsticks even. And those are sort of very passive aggressive little mini microaggressions that I don't think the person saying that really is aware that it's kind of belittling. And it's really great that you've added to Boreas's four discursive discrimination types with that one from Essed. You must have been so happy when you found that citation. It's like, yes, I can use that. Like, how did you find that? Is that a well-known citation? Because it fits your research perfectly, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah, so what was it? Essed has a really good book. Was it? Uh, Everyday Racism, I think. Yeah, and that was suggested to me by Professor Fairbrother, and she was just like, yeah, you should really look at the definitions that she has for these terms. And I looked at underestimation, and yeah, that was the perfect one for that quote. But there was also a few ones. She had a lot that like weren't Boreas's categories. So it makes me think like why Boreas, said those four categories when, there's so many other ways that it can kind of like exist within I guess language. Yeah, but that was something that I was glad, sort of matched my research. Also, I was really afraid to use the term microaggression because I was like often advised not to use that term by Professor Fairbrother because like there's because she teaches the class intercultural understanding, and she was talking about microaggressions, and I was the TA for that class, and I sort of stood in the back and I was like, you can't use microaggressions
So
because it
why did she say that you shouldn't use it?
because I guess like you're sort of assuming that someone's like meaning like aggression.
Oh,
Oh.
yeah, the intentionality of it. Yeah, this is what we were talking about earlier, right? It's really hard to know, was that racist? Was that a microaggression, or was it just, you know, coincidence?
Mhm.
I find that really, that's again the slipperiness of the racist discourse, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, intentionality is like such a big part of it. And some like scholars do make that distinction, like, what's it, intentional discrimination versus like non-intentional discrimination.
Yeah.
But it's kind of hard to know whether or not someone like intended or not, especially since our natural response as people is to say, oh no, I wasn't doing that.
Yeah, and it's we come across this in our daily lives a lot as well. Like, it's a long time since I had Christmas dinner with my family back in the UK, sadly. But I know that if I did, I would have to put up with what's often branded as casual racism. Like the drunk uncle starts spouting something a little bit off color about he doesn't like immigrants, and everyone just nods and, but like, should is that okay? Like most people just kind of let it slide, and I think that's a kind of slippery slope, really. And I think that but it's good to challenge people on that, or you don't even need to do it in a confrontational way. You can simply say, "What do you mean by that?" And as soon as you ask someone to explain their slightly off-color remark, they start to squirm, and you don't need to actually really put the screws on them. You can just simply say, "What do you mean?" Try and get them to be less ambiguous about what their comment is. So I think that's a good strategy. And I like that you had those six strategies that teachers use, because I think that's a really good thing for, like, as a focus for an article, like a very practical outcome. I think any research needs to have like a lot of good practical outcomes from it. So would you say that that was one of the main practical outcomes of your research?
Oh, definitely. Like I learned so much from doing this research, especially like the different strategies that I never imagined myself using. Like one of my favorite ones was like questioning, like where like say a supervisor of one of my participants said something like, oh like, this Canadian student should go back to Canada. And then they sort of asked them like, oh, why do you think that? And sort of like questioned like them and kept sort of questioning them. And then later that supervisor like sort of came to this self-realization, oh, maybe that's not exactly what I meant, or, maybe what I said could be quite problematic. So I thought that was really interesting. And maybe something that I want to use, during my next Thanksgiving gathering with my relatives.
Yeah.
Because like, yeah, I do have family that sometimes says some things I'm like, oh my God, like how could you say that? But yeah, like it's so I guess common for me to just like sort of like let that fly over my head. But when I'm in the shower or like I'm driving somewhere, like I have these like sick fantasies of like confronting my relatives about these things. I wish I had, said something witty or confronted them about this, because it's not right.
The French have a word for that, don't they? Rule d'escalier or something. The rule of the stairs. Like, as you go past someone in the stairs, and then later on you think, "Oh, I should have said that to them."
Yeah.
I'm not sure if my French is terrible, so I'm not sure if that's the right word. But yeah, so then you kind of get really obsessing about, "Oh, I should have said this, or should I have said that, or should I have challenged them?" So having a few pre-built strategies, like even if it's only like six is a good number, you can remember those, and then just like questioning. It's so really simple. And just if someone says something and you think, "Was that racist?" You can just say, "What do you mean by that?" And then bang, you're not having to do any of the talking anymore. And then if they're holding a shovel of racism, they're going to have to keep digging or throw it away and realize it as for what it was. So I think that's a great strategy, really good practical advice.
Yeah, I saw someone like use it recently, like
The
questioning as a
shovel.
strategy. It's so natural. Like, yeah, yeah. And I saw the person just keep digging, and I was like, oh, this is so good.
Mm.
It's so interesting. But yeah, like some people are just so natural at just like sort of combating these situations or like addressing them in their own like very unique ways. And yeah, at that time I was just like, oh wow, that person used it very effectively, and it's something that, I definitely want to implement in my later practices. Yeah.
So this actually is a nice seg to another question. As you were talking, I was busy scribbling down what I hope are intelligent follow-up questions to your fantastic research that are deserving to be asked. But I thought, like, I always wonder what's the job of a teacher? Well, a lot of my research is about motivation, and I always ask myself, is it my job to motivate my students, and how much is it my job to motivate them to what particular point? And I wonder, like, is it teachers' job to fight discrimination? Obviously,
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes there, but what do you think?
Oh, yeah. It's kind of hard, but like, yeah, like, I think especially in our field, like, teaching English, like we're teaching people to communicate with each other, and it's just like a very important communication. Like I guess it's important to communication that, we try to be like not as offensive or like, you know, disturb certain social norms. Is it called pragmatics? We have to adhere to those rules, or the rules of communication. And like also like as English teachers, we're teaching people to communicate with like different people. Like, and like what's most important in that is just like, think about others, like think about the feelings of others, or making sure like that the well-being of others is being protected. So definitely as teachers, like if we're nurturing people, like and like sort of like imparting or like helping them come to their own, shouldn't we help them like come to their being their own in the best possible way? I don't know if that makes sense.
That
But
makes, no, that makes great sense, Christine. And you know what? If I wasn't already fully entrenched in the world of language teaching, I would want to be a language teacher now because you made it sound really important. Like, yeah, this isn't the main part of our job is teaching the language, obviously, but like everything that goes with it, those cultural intersections, and any language, of course, but like English in particular being the world's second language and the language of international communication, it really behooves us as I knew I would end up using the word behoove. It really behooves us as language teachers to kind of be ready to address these issues. I've talked to a few people who try to avoid politics in their classroom. They try to avoid sensitive issues, and those sensitive issues would be race would be one, and gender would be another, and sexuality as well, which all of these things are in your thesis. And I'd really like to, we're sort of zeroing in a little bit on race at the moment, but I'd like to talk about some of those other things too. But I don't know if we'll have time because we've been here more than an hour, and I know that you're giving up your time to be here. But I think that it's sort of naive to think that you can have an apolitical classroom in the first place. So it's a good strategy, especially if you're quite a new teacher, to just be ready that that's going to come up whether you like it or not. In terms of gender and sexuality now. So I I've never really experienced as a sort of middle class white guy. I don't get to experience a lot of discrimination, which I'm very happy about, and I think I'm very lucky and privileged in that way. But these things still affect me, and even teaching in a class where you've got most of your students are from one culture, you're still going to come up across these issues. One thing that happened to me in one of my classes, I had a student who was trans, but I didn't know that they were trans because I had I didn't really I couldn't really tell, to be honest. Like, and I didn't really ask, of course. This was a long time ago and not in the university where I currently work, so I think it's okay to talk about it. But I had a student on the register whose name was female, and I had a student who wasn't on the register whose name was more androgynous, but this student wasn't on the register. So I kept reading out the female name, and oh, she never comes. And then one day, the trans student, it turns out, was a trans student, came to me and said, actually, that's me, but the university won't recognize my identity, and they refuse to let me change my name or go by the name that I've been calling them all this time. So like this, they were going to get an F because I thought they weren't attending the class, but actually it was one and the same person, but the institution wouldn't recognize their chosen identity. So like even though these issues haven't really affected me personally in my own life, they've affected me professionally a lot in my teaching because they affect students. And you've got to be, you know, quite sensitive to some of these issues sometimes, and that they will come up whether you want them to or not. And I think it helps to be prepared for those kind of things as well. Like with the sexuality one, so this one student who said they should give the boy who wrote about wanting a boyfriend a lower grade. That was an interesting moment. Can we maybe go back to that for a moment? Like, why did the teacher want to give them a lower grade, do you think?
Oh, like what was it? So originally they're supposed to write about like whether or not they think dating apps are appropriate or not. So
Hmm.
or like good for the future. So the kid wrote like, "Oh, I don't want a boyfriend, but or I don't want a girlfriend. I actually want a boyfriend." So, not knowing what to do with this like not knowing how to, grade the paper since it didn't answer the prompt, Rebecca sort of like talked to her coworkers like, what should we do about this? Like, how do we deal with this? And her coworker was just like, like just, grade his English. That's fine. Also, we should give him a lower grade because he wrote about wanting to have a boyfriend. And Rebecca was so shocked, and she's just like on her face, you can see her like, like make this like from the transcript, you can see that she sort of pulled this face, which actually caused the teacher to sort of like backtrack me, like, oh, but like, and Rebecca was like, but I'm not here to judge the students. He's like, yeah, yeah, well, yeah, just yeah, I'll deal with it, like sort of thing. Yeah, so I think that like maybe there is this sort of like I guess masculinity that he's trying to instill with or like indoctrinate into his students. I don't know.
Yeah, I wondered that. Now that I think about it, like, was it a weird power move on the part of the male teacher to show his own heterosexuality? Like, oh yeah, let's mark him down. And by the way, I'm very hetero. Oh. I wondered if there's an element of that to it as well. But because I think when we had the presentation, there was a question of whether or not it was just a mistake. Like, sometimes you mix up genders when you're writing in a foreign language, it's easy to happen. And they maybe meant girlfriend, but they wrote boyfriend, and that would be an English mistake. But it sounds
Mhm.
pretty unambiguous that this student wrote in the essay, I don't want a girlfriend, I want a boyfriend because I'm
Mhm.
gay. And this teacher then thought they should be marked down for being gay. That's
Yeah.
pretty unambiguously discriminatory, isn't it?
And Rebecca like thought it was really surprising because like this teacher was really young. And
Mm.
like he was like a homeroom teacher, so he deals with a lot of different students. And I think she said it was like a predominantly male school, so she was like, of course, there's bound to be somebody who is homosexual within that school. So she was like really surprised, like mostly because he was young. Like she was like, oh, he's young, he should have like more open views. But
Yeah, it's really shocking when you find young people with these discriminatory viewpoints, because we kind of hope, oh, it's just the older people, but actually, you can't. I don't. I think that maybe that's ageist, you know. I think, yeah, like, yeah, it's just it is a bit worrying to think that that's not just an old way of thinking, but it's actually, people of all ages have these discriminatory ideas. But also, like, maybe we'll start drawing it to a close in a moment. But I've had like quite a few situations in my teaching where students have come up to me and specifically wanted to kind of almost confess something to me, like they told me that they were gay, or they talk to me about their personal problems. And quite often, the fact that it's because I'm an English teacher and I'm not in their immediate social circle, I'm not even part of the wider cultural group, and I'm an outsider, it kind of makes you more approachable. You're less likely to gossip about it, or it's not likely to kind of get out. Do you have you experienced that yourself, like with students kind of coming up and kind of confiding in you?
Um, about other teachers, yeah. Like, yeah, no, I think this teacher's nasty. I'm like, oh, okay. Uh, but
Yeah,
yeah.
that's part of it too, though. Actually, I like students in my classes, they talk about all kinds of things. They know I can understand enough Japanese that they ought to be careful at least. I mean, maybe I don't understand everything, but I certainly know that they're saying nasty things about that person. But they do it anyway, I think, kind of because it's like I try to create a safe environment, where it's okay to talk about your feelings and what's going on with you. Like that's kind of how I try to make the lesson authentic by, you're not just coming in here to learn a language with that's made of grammar and vocabulary. You're here to express yourself and learn about, explaining yourself to a wider group of people.
Yeah, like a lot of my participants also talked about how like students would sort of come up to them and sorry, I had one participant who's like had a student who would just be like, oh, that student, that student, that student, yeah, they're gay. Like he would just be outing like his classmates. But he felt like comfortable with just like, like talking to one of my non-binary trans participants about that. Um but also like I also had a participant who was approached by students and they would like open up to them saying like, oh, I think I'm being like racially discriminated against by like my homeroom teacher. I don't really like my homeroom teacher. So they sort of saw these like, like I guess like teachers from not from Japan or from overseas as like sort of this like sort of safe space like where they could sort of open up about like some of the issues that they're dealing with them, maybe aren't really being addressed inside of like their homeroom classes or something that they can't really talk about like at home or something.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the really beautiful and transformative things about learning another language. And quite often, in my experience, obviously, people who've learned English. I like in my experience learning Japanese, I find that when I speak Japanese, I'm very limited by my own ability to speak and express things. But not only that, but the lower power that I have in the language and in the culture sort of means that I can't be as open or as direct as I would be perhaps in English. Like just have a different identity as a Japanese speaker. And I always assume there's a sort of deficit when you learn a foreign language, but that's not actually the case. I've spoken to a lot of people who said, no, no, my second language is the one that I'm most comfortable in. Like when I'm speaking English, for example, I can say whatever I like, and people are less likely to judge me. Like it's more of an accepting kind of and I think Kimie Takahashi did some really interesting research into language and gender about Japanese having a lot of it's a very gendered language. There's a lot of genderlect in it, like Japanese girls use different pronouns than Japanese boys, traditionally and in general, and not having to have that, we don't have those different pronouns in English. A lot of Takahashi's participants found that very freeing, I think. And I think that's really interesting to think of like language. It doesn't have to be a deficit that you're not able to express yourself. Perhaps sometimes it makes you more able to express yourself, be more authentic.
Hmm. Like sort of acting like a, how do you say, being an extension of yourself.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. I wish I could get to that level with my Japanese.
I'm not there with my Japanese.
I have a lot of other questions that I could have talked about, but I think I've discussed most of them. But I think we should wrap it up because you've given me an hour and a quarter of your time today, and I really appreciate that. So thanks so much, Christine, for sharing your research and talking about this fascinating topic. And I hope that the practical tips from your research will help, any teachers, new teachers or even experienced teachers, just having a few pre-prepared strategies for how to deal with this kind of discriminatory uh, discourse would really help just to make things a bit smoother when it happens in your classroom, because unfortunately it is going to happen. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for letting me talk about this. Yeah, I had so much fun.
It was fun, wasn't it? Yeah, I'm really glad that you agreed to do it.